Darryl Zanuck delivered his decision before the film had even finished playing. He didn't wait for the final reel. He spoke over it calmly, decisively, with the completed acquisition assessment already signed and resting on his armrest. The room understood immediately. This was not a discussion. The film had already been rejected. Brigitte Bardot sat at the back, not addressed, not consulted, present only to receive a decision that had been made before the screening began. But what happened next forced the entire room to confront that decision in a way it was never meant to be seen. The screening room held 11 people and a decision that had already been made. Bardot sat toward the back of the room. Not addressed, not consulted, present the way a subject is present in a formal proceeding, positioned to receive the outcome rather than to participate in shaping it. The film's final frames continued to move across the screen above Zanuck's head, light and image running through their last sequence, and no one in the room asked for the projection to be stopped because stopping it would have implied the conversation was more important than the film, and stopping it would have implied the film still had a claim on the room's attention. The legal representative along the side wall had already opened a folder on his knee before the first point of the assessment was completed. One producer had leaned toward the other and exchanged something at a volume that did not travel across the room, a brief, compressed exchange, the kind made between people who need to calibrate a shared position quickly before a conversation moves past the point where calibration is useful. The distribution staff in the middle rows had their pens positioned above their notepads. The room was running on the logic that the decision had been made, and the people in it had already begun moving toward the stage that followed decisions. The clipboard on Zanuck's armrest was visible from every seat in the front half of the screening room. Fox letterhead printed across the top in clean institutional type. A signature at the bottom in ink, deliberate and complete. The assessment between them, organized into the language of market requirements, structural observations, and distribution conditions, filling the page in the even, unhurried handwriting of a man who had written this kind of document many times before. The clipboard sat on the armrest, as though it had always been there, as though it were part of the furniture of the room rather than the instrument of a verdict that was currently being delivered over the top of a still-running film. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. By 1962, Darryl Zanuck had spent 4 decades building one of the most complete records of production authority in American cinema. His decisions did not require justification in the rooms where they were delivered. They arrived already carrying the institutional weight of 20th Century Fox behind them, a weight that had been accumulating since the studio's founding and that expressed itself most clearly in the specific quality of silence that entered a room when Zanuck began speaking. The silence of people who understood that the statement being made was not a position in a negotiation. It was the negotiation's result. Bardot's position in the American market in 1962 was precisely defined and precisely limited in ways that had been established before this screening was scheduled. She was commercially legible in certain European territories and editorially uncertain in others, and the American studios that had considered her for international productions had reached their working conclusions about that uncertainty before the relevant conversations were formally opened. The question of whether a Bardot picture could carry American distribution had been answered in distribution offices she had never entered, by people applying standards she had not been given the opportunity to address, and the answers had been circulating in the industry long enough that they had stopped requiring the support of evidence. The Fox European operation under Zanuck was not a satellite facility managing local content within guidelines sent from Los Angeles. It was a full production and acquisition center with autonomous authority to make distribution decisions affecting every market in the American network. A center whose endorsement opened the American distribution system and whose absence of endorsement closed it with equal completeness. A film that did not receive Zanuck's approval from this office did not receive American distribution, and it did not receive it in the specific permanent way that a door that has been closed from the inside does not open from the outside. The assessment on the clipboard was not a preliminary finding or a negotiating position. It was the final word in the language of people for whom final words were a professional instrument. The film on the screen had been made with American distribution at the center of its financial design. The casting decisions, the pacing, the narrative structure, the technical specifications, all of them calibrated for a crossover that the producers had built the budget around, and the distributors had planned their schedules around. The acquisition assessment on Zanuck's armrest described the distance between that design and the film that had been produced in language that was precise and market-specific and entirely without consolation. The distance it described was not small. It had been measured, written down, and signed before the screening began, which meant it had been produced from materials other than the film itself, from the materials of prior conclusion, of institutional judgment, of a decision made before the evidence was presented. The screening room had been arranged for this conversation without anyone announcing the arrangement. Zanuck in the front row, centrally positioned, the screen directly ahead of him, and the room arrayed behind him in the configuration of an audience receiving, rather than deliberating. The distribution staff and the legal representative placed along the walls in the positions of people who are present to record and implement, rather than to influence. The producers where they could see both the screen and the man in the front row simultaneously, their sightlines organized to receive both the film and the verdict on it in the same visual field. Bardot in the back, present, not placed, in the room without a position in its operational structure. Zanuck addressed the producers by name, both of them in sequence, using the specificity of names to establish who the relevant parties in the conversation were. His assessment moved through the film's structural problems in the order he had listed them on the clipboard, working from the top of the document toward the signature at the bottom, each point delivered at the same register as the one before it. None of them inflected upward into questions. None of them paused for long enough to constitute an invitation to respond. The pacing of the second act, the requirements of the American Censorship Board. The difficulty of constructing a marketing campaign for a picture whose lead occupied one cultural category in its country of production and a different, less legible category in the primary commercial territory. Each point was a completed sentence, and the sentences arrived in close enough succession that the space between them was not large enough to enter. The producers listened with the physical stillness of people who are processing information they cannot afford to visibly react to before they have determined their response. One of them, the older of the two, the one whose name Zanuck had used first, held a small notepad against his thigh with one hand and a pen against the notepad with the other, neither of them in motion. The other kept his arms folded across his chest, his attention fixed on Zanuck with the forward lean of a man who is tracking every sentence for the specific point where the assessment transitions from description to condition. Neither of them had looked toward the back of the room. The distribution staff member nearest the aisle was writing in measured intervals, not a continuous transcription, but periodic notations made at the moments when a point resolved into something specific enough to record. The intervals were even and professional, and they communicated that the assessment was being received as actionable direction, each notation a small, precise act of institutional alignment. The pen lifted, descended, lifted again. The notepad accumulated the session's architecture in the clean shorthand of a person who has been in rooms like this one before, and knows how to record what matters. The film's director had not spoken since the screening ended. He sat in the third row, with his arms crossed, and his body angled very slightly away from the screen, the posture of a person who is containing a response and has been containing it since the first point of the assessment arrived. His jaw was set without being visible as set, the tension in it readable only in the specific quality of the stillness in his face, which was the stillness of sustained restraint rather than the stillness of ease. He was watching the clipboard on Zanuck's armrest. His eyes had returned to it at the end of each of Zanuck's points and had not moved away from it during the pauses between them. Zanuck reached the final point on the assessment and introduced the pause that preceded a formal conclusion, the pause that signals a room that the statement being made is drawing toward its end and that the room should prepare to receive the end rather than the continuation. The legal representative turned a page in the folder on his knee, the movement precise and anticipatory. The pen of the nearest distribution staff member came to rest against the notepad without pressure, balanced rather than held, in the position of a pen whose work for this stage of the session is complete. The clipboard had not moved from Zanuck's armrest, since he had positioned it there before the lights went down. It had been present through the entire running of the film and through the entire delivery of the assessment, visible in the ambient light from the screen to anyone in the front rows, its completed face angled toward the ceiling, its signature visible as a mark at the document's lower edge from a distance of several seats. It was the most legible object in the room, in the sense that its meaning was clear from further away than its text could be read, a completed document, a signed conclusion, an institutional verdict in the specific form that institutional verdicts take when they have been produced by someone with the authority to make them final. Zanuck concluded his assessment and oriented himself toward the producers for the first time since beginning, a turn of the head, and a slight forward adjustment of posture that communicated availability for the conversation's next stage. It was not the posture of a man opening a position for reconsideration. It was the posture of a man who has delivered a complete statement and is now prepared to discuss the practical steps that follow from it. The producers straightened slightly in their seats. The distribution staff member closed the notepad with the careful final motion of someone concluding a working phase rather than pausing within one. The director's arms came uncrossed. The movement was gradual and deliberate, the forearms separating, the hands coming to rest on his knees, the body opening from the contained posture it had held through the assessment's entire delivery. He looked at the clipboard on the armrest with the direct, sustained attention of a man who has decided to focus on something specific rather than the general arrangement of the room. He had not spoken. His body had reorganized itself into a position from which speech was possible, but he had not yet produced it. Bardot's gaze had been on the clipboard since before the assessment concluded. From her position toward the back of the room, the document's face was not legible as text. The words were too small, the light too low, but the fact of the signature at the bottom was readable as a mark, as a completion, as the visual evidence of a process that had been carried through to its end before the film she had made was presented to the room in which its fate was being determined. The producers were straightening. The legal representative was organizing his folder. The room was moving toward the stage that came after the decision, and the clipboard on the armrest had not been touched. Zanuck's hand moved toward the clipboard. The movement was administrative and unhurried, the arm extending from the chair's armrest toward the board in the natural motion of a person reaching for a document they are about to put to further use, the fingers beginning to close around the upper edge of the board in the practiced grip of a man who has handled this kind of document many times and knows exactly how to hold it. The legal representative looked up from his folder in the direction of the movement. The producer with the notepad tracked the hand from his position in the middle rows. The room was converging on the clipboard from several directions at once. Bardot's hand reached the clipboard first. She rose from her seat in the back rows in a single motion, the body coming upright, the arm extending forward and across the space between her position and Zanuck's armrest in a line that was direct and without deviation, and her fingers closed around the board cleanly, lifting it from the armrest in the same moment that Zanuck's grip was forming around its upper edge. The board came free in one continuous movement. She turned it outward, facing its document toward the room, and raised it to a height at which the text was legible from the front rows. The Fox letterhead, the assessment, the signature, all of it facing the room rather than the ceiling, readable by every person present. The room went quiet in the specific register of a space that has lost the procedural logic organizing it. The board was no longer on the armrest. It was in Bardot's hands, facing outward, elevated to reading height, and the assessment that had been the session's structuring document, delivered as conclusion, received as authority, was now available to the room in a form that the room had not been arranged to produce. All eyes turned to the clipboard in Bardot's hands, to the letterhead at the top that identified the institution behind the verdict, to the body of the assessment that described the film's problems in the market's language, to the signature at the bottom that had made the document's conclusions binding before the screening began. The producers in the middle rows leaned forward simultaneously, their bodies moving toward the document before their postures had registered the decision to move. The distribution staff member's pen was suspended above the closed notepad, neither advancing nor retreating, held in the air at the height from which it had been in the process of being set down. Zanuck's hand remained in the position it had occupied when the clipboard left the armrest, the fingers still loosely curved in the shape of the grip that had been forming, still extended at the elevation of the armrest's surface, holding the air where the board had been. He looked at the hand, then he looked at the clipboard in Bardot's hands, its face toward the room, the document visible. He did not speak. He did not complete the reach or retract it immediately, and his hand remained at the armrest's level in the open, unfilled position of a grip that has been prepared for an object that is no longer there. No one moved toward the clipboard or away from it. The producers held their leaned forward positions without advancing the additional distance that would have brought them into contact with the situation rather than merely into its proximity. The director, who had been in the process of organizing himself toward speech when the board was lifted, was now entirely still on his feet, in the posture of someone who has risen and has not yet determined what the rising is for. The distribution staff member's pen had descended to the closed surface of the notepad and rested there without opening it. The legal representative's folder was closed in both his hands, the pages no longer being turned. The director's mouth opened. He had been moving toward speech since the moment his arms uncrossed, and the movement had now reached its destination, the jaw separating, the breath drawing in. But the words that followed were directed at the producers rather than at Zanuck, and they came in the form of a question about the document's specific language rather than a response to the assessment's overall conclusion. It was the first reorientation of the room's conversational structure since the session began, and it drew the two producers' attention from the clipboard toward the director and then back toward each other in the lateral movement of people recalibrating a shared position. 5 seconds passed. Zanuck's extended hand lowered to the armrest, not sharply, not with the speed of a deliberate gesture, but with the gradual descent of a limb releasing a held position under the instruction of no particular decision. The hand settled on the armrest surface, open, palm slightly upward, in the position of a hand that has finished holding something and has not been directed toward anything else. He looked at the clipboard in Bardot's hands for a sustained moment, not the quick look of a man assessing a situation, but the longer look of a man reading something he has already written. He did not speak. 10 seconds passed. The producer, who had been holding the notepad against his thigh, set it on the seat beside him. The movement separated his hands for the first time since the session began, one hand releasing the notepad, the other releasing the pen, both coming to rest in his lap in the open, unstacked position of hands that are no longer organized for a specific task. He looked at the other producer's arms, which had been folded across his chest since the assessment's opening, had come apart, the forearms separating without ceremony, the hands finding the armrests of his chair in the neutral position of someone whose previous posture no longer matches the room he is sitting in. The legal representative placed the closed folder on the empty seat beside him, removed it entirely from his lap, transferred it to the adjacent surface, released it there with the deliberate placement of someone removing an active instrument from an active position. His hands free of the folder settled in his lap. He looked at the clipboard in Bardot's hands, then at Zanuck, then at the producers. He did not produce a new document or reopen the one he had set aside. 15 seconds passed. The clipboard was still in Bardot's hands, still facing the room, still raised to the height at which it had been lifted. The document on its face, the assessment, the market language, the structural observations, the signature, was still visible from the front rows in the same configuration it had been in since the moment it was turned outward. The armrest beside Zanuck was smooth and empty, the surface that had held the document for the duration of the session now unoccupied and without purpose. The director spoke again, a second statement, directed this time at Zanuck rather than at the producers, in the clear, undeflected voice of a man who has completed the process of deciding to speak and is now speaking without further preliminary. Zanuck looked at him, the look was direct and held, and he did not interrupt, which was itself a departure from the session's established rhythm, a rhythm that had not, until this point, included pauses long enough for the director to occupy. The clipboard remained in Bardot's hands through the director's statement, through Zanuck's sustained look, through the producer's exchange of recalibrated positions. The film on the screen had reached its final frame, the projector running its last light through the last image of the picture, whose commercial fate the document described, the light holding for a moment on the blank white surface of the screen before the mechanism completed its cycle and the image went dark. The room was still seated in the configuration Zanuck had arranged, and the conversation was running in a direction that configuration had not been built to produce. What the screening room held in its remaining minutes was not the session Zanuck had organized and delivered from the front row. The document was the same document, the same letterhead, the same assessment, the same signature. The people were the same people, in the same seats, in the same room. The clipboard that had been the session's fixed point, its structuring object, the signed conclusion of an authority that had not required justification to be exercised, was in different hands, facing a different direction, readable by everyone who had been arranged to receive it as a final word. The conversation continued. The room that had been built for one ending was sitting inside a different one, and the film on the screen had gone dark, and no one had asked for the lights.